Okay, first of all, Mr. Ran, when did you visit Bulgaria for the very first time, and what were your first impressions, both personal and professional?
Well, I first visited in the spring of 1990, and it didn't really surprise me because I had spent time in other Eastern European countries. I'd spent quite a bit of time in Hungary and I'd been in Estonia. And so, I mean, Bulgaria was poorer, but not that significantly different. And I had been in a number of communist countries, so I was well aware of what communist countries looked like, which they were a mess. But
how did you see Bulgaria in that first meeting with the Bulgarian people, the Bulgarian country? How was in your expectations, and how was in the reality actually?
Well, I don't remember being particularly shocked or anything. I was impressed with the friendliness of the people I met, and we had some very good discussions. And clearly, the people I was talking to wanted to bring about change in Bulgaria, and which it needed it. And so we had, I thought, very productive discussions, very friendly, and I thought your country was very beautiful.
Okay, so what are your memories from the discussions on the preparation of the Run-Ът plan? When did the process exactly start, and what were the attitudes back then in the Bulgarian parties?
Well, we started the plan just a couple of months after my first visit, because with my visit, there was people wanted to know what they should do. And I had already worked on the Hungarian transition project, which was headed up by the American politician, economist, Pete DuPont, and the German economist, Helmut Gersch. So I was basically aware of what you do. Things weren't that much different in Bulgaria. And so when we had a discussion, I told them I could indeed put together a team of experts, of economists, lawyers, business people, other specialists, to start working with people in Bulgaria about putting together a real transition team. And they very much wanted that. It was sort of interactive back and forth. And at the time, our U.S. ambassador was a fellow named Saul Polanski. And so I kept in contact with him, told him what was going on. And he encouraged me also to proceed with the effort. And so we did.
How was the point of view of Bulgarian parties about your visit? Were they separated between left and right? You know, there is always some separation in
Well, we had a lot of problems there. I mean, we had some of the still diehard communists who didn't want to do anything, but they were very small. They were not much of a problem. And then we had, between the forces that wanted change, there was a group of people who wanted to be bold and act quickly in a way that the Poles did under Belarus. And there were people who wanted to go gradual. And then there were just a lot of personality fights between our Bulgarian partners. And one of the biggest problems I had, we put together an American team, and the Bulgarians had selected their team. And they had a wide variety of people on the team, and a wide variety of viewpoints. And a number of the Bulgarians did not get along with each other. In fact, at one time, I remember one of the Bulgarians, who was a key figure, refused to be in the meeting if there were some other ones for them. Well, in fact, the person he most disliked was Ivan Angelov, who was Prime Minister Lukanov's economic advisor. Ivan was a very nice guy, but he was, at that point, he was very pleasant and he knew you needed change, but he wasn't sort of more radical like some of the other guys and how fast this should be done and how it should be done. And there was all these conflicts, and I had to mitigate a lot of the differences and try to keep that together. I didn't have a problem with the American team. We were all very much unified, and evenings we'd sit down and discuss, we had different points of view about things. We'd all work it out. But the big problem was with the Bulgarian team because the passions were so great. There was, in each of these countries, there are a variety of groups. I remember in Hungary, there was a powerful group called the Smallholders Party, which represented smaller farmers, and they were just getting some small businessmen, and they had a lot of influence. And the current Hungarian president at that time, his Fidesz party was only allowed people in who were less than 35 years of age, and they were very libertarian. Of course, as they all got older, they changed the age requirement. And I don't know how old the president is now. I guess he's probably in the 60s. But I remember a lot of those changes. But there's still, in each country, you have, as you do in any normal country, you have a wide range of views. There's a political spectrum from people who are, some of them are almost anarchist or very libertarian, to those who are traditional conservatives, to sort of quasi-socialist, to hardcore socialist, to communist. And you had the whole spectrum, both in Hungary, in Estonia, other countries I've worked in, the Czech Republic. One sort of funny thing at the time, there's a little monarchist party that got started, and King Simeon's son, who was a young agricultural economist in the United States at the time, wanted to join our team. And I wouldn't let him because I didn't want to get into party politics at that point. He was in favor of the monarchist party for sort of obvious reasons. And there was just those sort of amusing conflicts. And I told him, it was Bibi and I, told me he just couldn't be a member of the team. And he was quite upset with me about that. But those kind of decisions I had to make.
Okay, what were your suggestions for the liberalization of the prices in Bulgaria, privatization, development of the economy and the agriculture, also changes in the tax system and avoiding of the hyperinflation we faced later? So these points, main points of your plan that actually didn't, the parties didn't implement. So the liberalization of prices, privatization, development of the economy, and of course agriculture, changes in the tax system, and avoiding the hyperinflation that we forced later.
Well, actually, we did get liberalization of prices right off because the government couldn't enforce the old price controls. One thing that happened is there was no tax revenue coming in. And as a result of the tax revenue, they couldn't pay the government employees, and they had all these regulatory agencies. And at the time, there was great concern about that. And I said, well, most of these agencies you don't need. And again, things like price controls. The market will determine that. And we even had a period of free trade because they couldn't pay the customs agents and so forth. And there had been a lot of smuggling. And so the way to get rid of the smuggling was just go to free trade. And they did some of these things initially, then they sort of backtracked. And the Germans were some of the pushing on the other side to keep some regulations and things more so than I wanted. Actually, I had more problems with the IMF and the World Bank and the Germans who wanted to do more regulation, and I thought was desirable.
Actually, there was years ago some kind of privatization. 20 years ago, it stopped. Some kind of liberalization of the prices just 1 year after your visit, I think. And also some tries to make some agriculture changes, but actually what you want to do in your plan, what is main point of view of your plan, wasn't implemented, yes?
It took a long time, and some things were implemented in partial ways. It was disappointing in ways, with like agricultural privatization. Fortunately, Bulgaria still had most of the land records from the pre-1948 period. So unlike the Soviet Union or in Russia, which I worked in, where there were no records, in Bulgaria we had the records of who actually had owned what. So there was ways of doing some of that privatization, restitution of properties. And again, it was rocky, but a lot of stuff was done. On the privatization in general, my colleague Ran-Ът, who was an expert in privatization, and he'd been the privatization czar in the US, and he developed a whole system for doing tender offers of a lot of these old state companies and trying to privatize them. We had problems there because the accounting was often so bad. And I remember going to some of these factories and they'd give me copies of the books, but you had periods of hyperinflation. And so the periods, let's say, of 10 years previous, as contrasted with the current day, the numbers made no sense because the value of the lead had so radically changed by thousands of percent. And we had just a lot of sort of technical problems like that. And we basically found we had to re-inventory and start all over again and look at the value of the assets. And many of the enterprises weren't really worth very much, even though a lot of money had been invested in them, but they were behind technologically because, you know, the world moves very quickly. And if you're outdated by 2 or 3 years, often you lose your market share. I remember there was a chemical plant up near Varna, and the government had put a lot of money into building it, but they were basically outdated in some of the technology even by the time they got it done. And they didn't have the advantage of low-cost feedstocks. They lost their market, which used to be the old Soviet Union. And I remember the day I had given the board the bad news that the company was basically worthless, even though several $100 million had been invested in it. And it was hard for them to understand because they're engineers and you have all this physical plant, but it just wasn't economic. And so there are a lot of problems like that.
Bulgaria was in de facto bankruptcy, including due to the markets lost in the Arab world. What were the alternatives for financing back then? Loans from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or was there any another opportunity for the Bulgarian?
Well, there are lots of aid agencies coming in from the West to provide loans, but a lot of these things weren't well done. And I remember I had a big fight with a fellow from the World Bank who was a Brit, and they had put money into the telephone company, Voltel, a loan, but they had gotten a bill passed in Parliament that the government wouldn't allow any competition. And we were trying to bring in competitive phone companies. I had AT&T and Sprint and Telecom all willing to come into the Bulgarian market. And we thought the best thing would be good competition within Bulgaria among the telecommunication companies. And this fellow from the World Bank and I had this big argument. I still remember it was a lobby of the Sheraton Hotel because he'd gotten a loan for Voltel from the World Bank. And I said, well, this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to have competition. He said, well, we have to make sure our loans paid back, which really wasn't the objective. The objective is to modernize the Bulgarian telephone system and bring you up to date, as you now are. But there was a lot of, I had as many problems with the international bureaucrats as I did with the Bulgarians, because they're all were wedded to their old ideas. And there was an awful lot of statism among these international agencies, and change has been made. Fortunately, the World Bank now has a very good president, a guy named David Malpass, who is a good friend, and they're making a lot of changes. And of course, the IMF now has a Bulgarian as head of the IMF, and nobody could have envisioned that 30 years ago, that you would have a Bulgarian woman as head of the IMF. So things have moved along well, and anyway, I'm basically pleased.
So Bulgaria suffered a period of hyperinflation and bankruptcy in early '97, so known as the Videnovata winter, as you know. Were the unrealized reforms among the reason for this huge crisis?
No, the problem was, I had originally suggested that Bulgaria either just adopt a foreign currency, the US dollar or the D-mark, or at least fix the currency to that, or have a backing of commodity backing. And I put that in the original report, and I argued for that, basically setting up a currency board. And the more we discussed it, we thought the ideal thing was for Bulgaria to have a currency board, which we eventually got. And there was a great deal of resistance to it at the time because people, I still remember one of the fellows at the central bank, nice fellow, but he didn't understand, I don't think, international monetary mechanics very well. And he kept saying to me, well, Richard, we can manage it perfectly well. And I said, I doubt that will happen. I think you will have another round of inflation. And I wasn't getting any place, so I brought Sir Alan Walters, who was Margaret Thatcher's chief economic advisor, Burrell Sprinkle, who was President Reagan's chief economic advisor, and a very well-known monetary economist who's been to Bulgaria many times, Steve Hanke. And so the four of us met, and I said, well, if you don't believe me, I've got the world's 3 top experts in this. Why don't you listen to them? And we were still rejected. I still remember we had these meetings, and they kept saying, well, we're wrong. I mean, we were wrong and they were right. I remember walking out of one of the meetings, and Sir Alan turns to me and he says, the young man who was running from the Bulgarian side, he said, that young man has much to learn. Well, of course, then you went through the next round of hyperinflation, and that was the Vidnov government, who was just fiscally irresponsible. They just spent money they didn't have. And I always look at that government as very corrupt. And so I had gotten a call, I guess it was in '96, when we were going through the hyperinflation, and I'm trying to remember who called me from Bulgaria, and they said, well, the currency board, could you help us establish that? And by that time, the IMF was active in there. And Warren Coates, a very good economist who set up a number of currency boards in Eastern Europe, came into Bulgaria, and with the IMF team, and helped to establish it. And they picked a very good fellow Bulgarian to run the central bank, and he had been spent a few years as an investment banker in London, so he knew international finance. And was named Zimov, and very good guy. And of course, once you put the currency board in, you basically had stable money, and so that worked out. But you had to go through a lot of pain in the meantime.
Privatization was carried out in Bulgaria, but the result was, for all the people, actually was not satisfactory. Most of the enterprises have been sold. There was no control over the investors, and the participation of the Bulgarian people, actually, as shareholders, was never realized. Where did the country go wrong with the privatization, in your opinion, and were the right investors not attracted of the model itself, and it was not effective?
No, your basic problem was corruption, particularly corruption in the court system. And I remember in one case, there had been a tender put out, I think if I recall correctly, on a carpet factory, made big industrial carpets. And it was bought by some Western investors, and it was producing, and they had markets in the US and elsewhere. One day, the head of the company calls me up and said, Richard, they took our company from us. And there had been some corruption among the judges who took away the ownership from the group that bought it and gave it to somebody else. Well, there was a lot of these cases. And that problem of rule of law, I always looked at as Bulgaria's biggest problem. I mean, in the US and most of Western Europe, England, Scandinavia particularly, the courts tend to be both honest with competent judges. There's always exceptions, of course. But if I go to court here in the US over a commercial dispute, I normally would assume the judge would be honest and competent and understand the law. And whether I win or lose, I figured most people think they get a fair hearing. In Bulgaria, that was not the case. And that persistent corruption, particularly in the judicial system, I think held back a lot of the progress.
And what was your point of view, in your opinion, which is more effective, fast privatization or slower and more gradual, which allows of the majority of the revenues to be retained? So which one was your opinion in that period of time and now? Slow or fast privatization?
At the time, I was for fairly speedy privatization, but nowadays I would even be for even faster. Again, the Polish experience under Lazar Belarovich, they did it very quickly, and I think the Belarovich model was probably the best. You have to remember, most of these enterprises really weren't worth very much because they'd been so mismanaged, the allocation of capital had been so bad. So most of them had to basically start over again. And I haven't looked at the leading Bulgarian enterprises in recent years, but I would bet that most of the things that really add to Bulgarian GDP, most of the companies, are new companies. They might have a little thread back to the old state companies. But you had DZU, which was your big disk drive company out in Stara Zagora, and which at the time might have been at least Bulgaria's biggest industrial enterprise. It made disk drives for the whole communist bloc. Well, when the changes happened in the fall of '89 and '90 and so forth, it lost virtually all of its market. And its technology lagged the West by a couple of years, even though they, in fact, they had a stolen Winchester disk drive and reverse engineered it, which was a remarkable feat. But the fellow who actually stole it out of the US explained to me how he had done this whole thing, and I'd been out to DZU a number of times, and they bought a lot of Japanese and German machinery to build these things, which are very, very difficult. But the trouble is they couldn't keep up with the technology, and then they even took an interest in a firm in California that was sort of state-of-the-art, but that didn't really work very well. And it was a shame because it was a beautiful industrial enterprise, and if it had been managed differently, it could have been a great success because they had fantastic engineers out there. And last I knew, they were ended up making things like door locks rather than high-tech electronics.
A progressive tax has been proposed in your plan, as I can remember. Which system do you consider is better? According to many economists, the flat tax is currently the basis for the progress of the Bulgarian GDP, at least before the COVID, because now the situation is changing faster. So which one is in your opinion, the better option for Bulgaria? Flat, which is now, or the other progressive?
The flat tax is definitely the best. And at the time, I wish I'd been bolder about pushing it. We had said, well, you ought to have very low rate taxes. But we thought politically we had to have some progressivity to get the thing politically sold. I was wrong on that. And because I had written a lot of things in favor of the flat tax. In fact, in Russia, I was credited with being the first one to suggest the flat tax in Russia. And so it's by far the superior tax. And that's, I mean, your flat tax in both corporate and personal income is one of the great successes of Bulgaria, and you ought not to get rid of it.
Before the COVID crisis, actually, Bulgaria was on the verge of entering the eurozone, waiting room, but the opinions in the country were poor. So whether Bulgaria should submit documents and apply or keep the left as currency. What is your opinion actually about that topic? Should we start to be at waiting room for eurozone, or we shall stay like this in our currency?
Well, I had been in favor of you joining the eurozone, but given the mess that's now occurring in Europe, it may not be such a good idea. I haven't looked at the issue closely enough, but I mean, I see the situation in Italy, and of course what happened in Greece, and even in Spain. And I think there's a good chance that the European Monetary Union, that part of the experiment, will fall apart. Or we may have something where the Northern European countries remain, but many of the others, well, example, Greece. Greece got in at the wrong prices initially, and it's never been viable for Greece, still isn't. And again, we look at the Italian economy, a situation there. It's hard to see how this can be sustained. I mean, the Germans are basically subsidizing everybody else now. So I think I'd be cautious moving towards Eurozone, but I don't really feel like I'm prepared well enough now to make any kind of firm recommendation there. But Bob Mundell, who originally developed a plan for the euro, very good economist, and it made a lot of sense in the optimum currency area. But again, the politicians all through Europe have nothing to do with Bulgaria, just the Western European politicians didn't do what was required, and that is to manage each of the economies with fiscal soundness. And when you have these huge debt burdens, I mean, within a year, Italy will probably be over 200% debt as a percentage of GDP. Well, that's not sustainable. I mean, we saw what happened in Greece. And until the various countries get their fiscal houses in order, it's very hard to have a unified currency. Now, the Germans have been good. They have a relatively low debt as a percentage of GDP, and they don't run much in the way of deficits. But the rest of the continent doesn't act like the Germans, and that's the problem.
What are your expectations for the global economy after the end of the coronavirus crisis? Because should we expect a recession, or could the coming crisis be more severe than the Great Depression that was like before? And what should be done actually by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, local parliaments, and the European Union?
Okay, there was a very good article in the Wall Street Journal today by our friend Barbara Combe, who's on the vice president of the Austrian Central Bank, and she's head of the Austrian Economic Center in Vienna. And she's talking about how Austria is beginning to loosen up and trying to get the economy working again. And Vernon Smith, the Nobel laureate, had an article in the Wall Street Journal just a few days ago about how the turnaround should take place. Now, we've all been debating whether you can have, the so-called V-shaped recession or U-shape. Clearly, this quarter, the whole world economy will be in deep recession. The Chinese, the Japanese, the Russians, all the Europeans, and America. I mean, our economy was just booming along. Up until March, we had the strongest economy in the world. We still do, but things are a mess now. We've shut down virtually a quarter of our economy. And I think that's true in most other countries. And so, because we've never experienced anything like this before, this was a deliberate shutdown of the world economy by governments. And so we don't have any, that's never happened before, so we don't have any guidebook to say, okay, what should be done. I don't think the IMF and World Bank have much of a role to play in this. They have to be the individual countries. And my belief, and I'm going to write a column on it this week, is that the faster they go back to normal, the better. And I think there was somewhat of an overreaction. I mean, you had the tragedy of deaths in particular places like Italy, New York City, the other places. But most of the death totals have been fairly low. Shutting down your whole economy because 21 people died makes no sense. And in much of the US, we've got a lot of our states which have, you know, the size of Bulgaria, but they have, again, a few dozen deaths. New York City is different because there they had a number of thousands. Italy is different. But these other places, I think the sooner they get back to work and running a normal economy, the better. The longer governments delay the return to normality, the worse the world economy is going to be. And there's all these unknowns. I mean, we don't know if the virus will come back and how severe it will be and so forth. But we know that primarily older people get it. I mean, I'm the endangered group because I'm now an older man, but you young folks, there's virtually no danger for you. And there's no reason why you shouldn't be doing work, going back to work. People of my age group, probably important that we are more careful about getting in crowds and mingling with people. But there's a balance here. And I think the world overreacted. And I know that makes me unpopular. Some people say, oh, Richard, you want to kill people? Of course I don't. But I also understand the dangers of an economic shutdown for a long period of time because people die when your economies are not strong. And you need a strong economy to provide people the kind of sustenance and good life. There's a question of also just plain liberty, which isn't talked much about.
Is the dollar actually now and the other main currencies stable enough?
Of course, what you've been having is people rushing into the dollar. The dollar has been rising in value, which is basically good for America. I mean, we have a flow of money coming in, but we don't really have stable currencies. I've done a longer paper on advocating that we use an aluminum standard, which may sound very strange, but I've done some papers on why this makes sense because it's found every place in the world. The world prospered in the years we were under the gold standard, and particularly in the late 1800s up to 1914, up to the First World War. And that was a period of great prosperity around the world. We didn't have problems, exchange rate problems, because every country, all the major countries, were on the gold standard. Well, unfortunately, because the politicians had messed up gold, so it'd be very hard to go back to the gold standard. And so I was looking around for other alternatives. That's why I suggested aluminum. I mean, I'm all for cryptocurrencies, but I think cryptocurrencies really need to have real backing so you don't have those kind of price fluctuations you have with things like Bitcoin.
What will be your advice to the Bulgarian government and the Bulgarians in particular if they now invite you to come up with a plan for a way out of the upcoming crisis, like 30 years ago? So the Bulgarian government now expects a deficit of up to 3.5 billion by 2020, which is about 3% of the GDP. At its last sitting, Parliament allowed the maximum amount of national debt this year to increase from 2.2 billion up to 10 billion level. What is the best solution in this case, in your opinion? Debt or tax increases, which is not expected so far? What is your plan now? If I was some prime minister of Bulgaria, I invite you to come up with your plan and to find a solution for a situation, for example.
Well, you certainly don't want to do tax increases. I mean, tax increases are just like poisoning the patient. It's like when they used to bleed patients, you know, when they get ill, they would draw blood from them. Of course, it hastened their death. That happened to our first president, George Washington. So you don't want to do that. Really, the only answer is to get spending back under control. And my concern is that we've so increased spending. In the US, we've increased spending by $6 trillion. And even for an economy like the US, that's a stupendous amount of money. And today the Congress is debating about adding another 600 billion or so to it. And this is absurd. And as I mentioned, like with Italy, and you have all these countries who can't pay this back. I mean, I look at the debt burdens country by country, and you've got maybe Norway, Switzerland, Germany, and a couple others around the world who are basically solvent, and the rest of the economies are headed towards insolvency, basically the whole world. What that means, of course, is all these people who have bought government paper. I mean, you got negative interest rates in much of Europe. Who bought all this, they're never going to get their money back. And you sort of start over, but that's going to be very painful. And I mean, Bulgaria is small enough, and your degrees of discretion are pretty small in Bulgaria. But basically, to the extent you can be more fiscally responsible than your competitive nations, you'll be better off. But how all this is going to work out, I don't know. But it doesn't look good to me. Situation changes week by week. You know, sometimes you're glad you're not head of a government. I mean, the pressure that President Trump is under, just incredible. I mean, the responsibility and things, so much of it is out of his control. And that's true with most of the leaders. I mean, we see Boris Johnson in the UK even coming down with a virus. I mean, it's a mess over the globe. And of course, the Chinese have been totally duplicitous about all this. If they told the truth back in December, we could have, all the countries of the world could have prepared for it, but they didn't. And we are where we are.
What would you advise the Bulgarian people? There are options and opinions from people who want to withdraw their savings, worried about the possible bank failures. It was not the first time that this happened in Bulgaria. Although the government said the banking system is stable, stress tests have been carried out in different banks. Where should we invest money now? So I want to ask you something. First, to fix this problem, because actually there are people that are very worried about the bank sector and their savings.
Yeah. Now, this isn't unique to Bulgaria. Every day, people are asking me, Richard, what should I do with my investments or my savings? In fact, I have to do a Monday morning, or a week from Monday, I've got to give a presentation before a finance class at graduate school here in Miami, where I am now, and to talk about this. But none of us know, because we don't know what the outcome is going to be of not only the virus, but the response to it. So what does a prudent person do? The banks, again, I haven't looked closely at all at the Bulgarian banking situation, but since you're part of the international order now, I would expect that there will be bailouts of the banks. In the US, we're not going to let our big banks fail. And I don't think they're greatly in danger of that happening anyway. But that doesn't mean you'll not have a write-down of the value of those deposits. Be like it was at the time of the revolution back in '89 and '90 and '91 in Russia. Remember, the poor Russians, they put all their money in a spare bank and they lost all the savings people had accumulated over the years. Of course, in Bulgaria, with the hyperinflations, people lost their savings. So what do? You keep some of your money in equities and stakes in firms. You keep some of it fairly liquid in well, we have a strict deposit, but with strong banks, it's sort of a cash or close to cash alternatives. It's good to have some real estate if you can have it. I remember one thing that saved the Bulgarians early on was the fact that you hadn't totally communized the whole country, and that many people, particularly in rural areas, had these garden plots that they could raise some of their own food. And during late 89, 90, 91, that saved a lot of people's lives because they weren't getting any government support. And if they hadn't had those fruit trees and vegetable gardens and things, they'd been in a far worse situation. There were some of the farmer markets that opened up. And I mean, I don't look at that kind of situation occurring again like we had back then. But it's going to be messy over the next couple of years. And sort of being basically prudent. But once the economies start moving ahead again, there's no reason they can't pick up where they left off, let's say, at the end of last year or even the beginning of this year. But it may take a while. I don't have any panacea for the Bulgarians or for the Americans. We're all in the same boat. Globally, we're now in the same boat. I mean, there's no longer the great differences between countries any longer. As you see, it's over the world, whether you're in Asia or Europe or South America or North America, everybody's facing the same problem.
Extraordinary situation for sure. So where should we invest our money now? Real estate if prices fell, gold, or what are you thinking about this? Or live in the bank deposit? Because actually people that have some savings now, they are thinking where to invest, to keep the money on the bank or to buy some gold, or for example, to invest in rent, because also it's a possibility. Yeah. What is your opinion about that?
I just think having the money, because none of us know which things are going to work and which aren't. And I'll just say my own case. I keep some of my money in real estate. I keep some in corporate stocks. And I keep some in very liquid, money market certificates or bond funds. And because I don't know which one's going to do better or least bad. So, because none of us have perfect foresight of what's going to happen in the future. There's the whole Austrian school of economics you may well be familiar with, and particularly the great Austrian economists like Hayek, who I was fortunate to know the last 10 years of his life. One of the great insights Hayek had was people go off and the search for perfect knowledge, and they want to see the future. And all these people make money by selling investment newsletters. They used to be like fortune tellers, on the streets and say, I'm going to tell you, Alexander, I'm going to tell you your fortune. But of course, it was all nonsense. Nowadays, these people are investment advisors. They do the sort of the same thing and say, I know what's going to happen in the future. Of course, none of them do. And Hayek wrote the basic book, The Limits of Knowledge. And the thing we don't know is about the future. I mean, you take a look, last November, you look at all the forecasts over the globe for the world economy for 2020. And most every economist in most every country said, oh, it's going to be a whole lot better. Nobody saw the pandemic coming. All of a sudden, this hits out of the blue, and it upends the entire world. So, so what does a prudent person do? They just diversifies their assets and realizing the next few months or next year or so will be rough. But if you have enough diversification, you're not going to starve to death.
So this is like last question. How can the government actually help to the poorest and the unemployed in this situation? In Bulgaria, however, the measure faces serious resistance. What is your opinion about this? So how the government actually can help to the people? By giving them loans, by paying the 60% of the salary, or which one is the better option? Something different?
Well, none of these things are going to work over the long run. I mean, you can give people money temporarily, but if there's not production going along with it, everybody's real wealth will decline. I mean, wealth is created by people working with the latest technologies. That creates real wealth. If the government's shelling out money, the government can print money, that's not real wealth. But it's a way of keeping people, being able to pay for their housing and their food and so forth. Temporarily, a lot of these programs are okay. But if they go on for more than a few months, it's not going to work terribly well. Key thing is to get people back to work.